The great hall of the Galactic Council fell silent as the morning session began, and every eye turned toward the empty chairs where the human delegation should have been sitting. Ambassador Velthorin of the Kathmari Collective was the first to speak, his forearms gesturing dismissively as he addressed the assembly of 1,000 different species. "Typical humans," he said with a snort that echoed through the chamber. "They have no respect for our traditions, and they never arrive on time." Several delegates laughed at this, because making fun of humans had become something of a sport among the elder races over the past 2 centuries. The humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, having discovered faster than light travel only 200 years ago, and many species still considered them to be little more than clever animals who had stumbled upon technology. They did not deserve. High Arbiter Sylveth raised her crystalline hand to restore order in the chamber and announced that the session would proceed without the human representatives. "They will receive the standard fine for absence," she declared. "Let us move on to more important matters." But as the hours passed and the session continued, something strange began to happen in the council hall. Delegates found themselves glancing at those empty seats again and again, as if expecting the humans to burst through the doors at any moment with their loud voices and their strange jokes and their cups of that bitter black drink they carried everywhere. Humans had always been annoying in their presence, but their absence felt somehow worse. By the end of the first day, the Rithian Trade Minister sent a message to the human embassy on the council station, but received no reply. By the end of the first week, the council had dispatched a courier ship to Earth, the human homeworld, to demand an explanation for this unprecedented absence. The ship returned 3 days later with news that made the entire assembly fall into shocked silence. Earth was empty, not destroyed, not damaged, not attacked by some unknown enemy, but simply and completely empty. The city still stood in all their chaotic human glory, with their strange mix of old and new architecture that the humans seemed to love so much. The vehicles still sat in their parking spaces, and the food still rotted in the refrigerators, and the pets wandered the streets looking for owners who would never return. But there was not a single human being anywhere on the planet. 8 billion souls had vanished without a trace, without a struggle, without leaving behind so much as a note to explain where they had gone. The council immediately sent investigation teams to every human colony in the galaxy, and the reports that came back were all the same. 40 billion humans across 200 worlds had disappeared in what appeared to be a single instant. There were no bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of any known weapon or disease or natural disaster. It was as if the universe itself had reached down and simply erased humanity from existence. Valkyrie sent their most powerful telepaths to search for any trace of human consciousness in the void between stars, but they found nothing except a strange and terrible silence where humanity used to be. The great archives of the Methrony were consulted, their ancient records stretching back millions of years, but they had no explanation for what had happened. Some species celebrated at first, because humans had made many enemies during their brief time on the galactic stage. The Korvathi swarm had never forgiven humanity for stopping their expansion into the Deleth Principality, and they held feasts that lasted for days when they heard the news. The hegemony of 12 stars had always resented human interference in their internal affairs, and they immediately began planning to reclaim territories they had lost to human diplomacy. But as weeks turned into months, the celebrations grew quieter and the planning grew more difficult, because the galaxy was beginning to discover something that nobody had expected. Humanity had been far more important than anyone had realized. The first sign came when the Rithian Trade Consortium reported that their economy was collapsing. It turned out that humans had been responsible for nearly 30% of all trade in the known galaxy. not because they produced the most goods or controlled the most territory, but because they would trade with anyone. Humans bought alien art that no other species wanted, and sold human music that somehow made beings with completely different biology feel emotions they had never experienced before. Humans hired workers that other species considered unemployable and created jobs that had never existed before they came along. Without human merchants and human consumers and human creativity, trade routes that had existed for centuries began to wither and die. The second sign came when the border wars resumed. The council had always believed that they were the ones keeping peace in the galaxy through their wise leadership and their ancient laws, but the investigation into the human disappearance had uncovered something embarrassing. In the past 200 years, humans had quietly mediated over 3,000 disputes between species, often without any official authority or recognition. They had done this in back rooms, in cantinas, and aboard private ships, trading favors and sharing drinks, and somehow convincing ancient enemies to put aside their hatred for just a little while longer. They had done this because humans seemed to find war genuinely upsetting in a way that other species did not understand. Now those carefully built truces were falling apart one by one, and species that had not fought in generations were remembering old grudges and sharpening old weapons. High Arbiter Sylveth sat alone in her chambers one night, reading through the reports that her staff had compiled on human activities over the past 2 centuries. She had never paid much attention to the humans before, seeing them as little more than a nuisance to be tolerated until they grew up or destroyed themselves. But the records told a different story. A story of a species that had quietly and stubbornly made itself essential to the functioning of galactic civilization. Humans had contributed to 40% of all medical advances since their arrival, not because they were smarter than the elder races, but because they asked questions that nobody else thought to ask. Human engineers had improved faster than light technology by 30% through modifications that the great minds of the galaxy had dismissed as too crude to work. Human artists had inspired a cultural renaissance across 12 sectors, and human philosophers had challenged assumptions that had stood unchallenged for millions of years. And then there was the thing that disturbed Sylveth most of all. She had discovered records of something called the Humanity First Response Network, a volunteer organization that had no official status and no government funding and no recognition from the council. This network of human ships and human volunteers had answered 94% of all distress calls in council space. Over the past century, they had come not for profit or politics or glory, but simply because someone somewhere was in trouble and needed help solve. Put down the reports and stared at the empty space where the human ambassador used to sit. During their private meetings, they were holding us together, she whispered into the silence. They were holding everything together, and we never even noticed. She thought about all the time she had dismissed human concerns as unimportant, all the time she had laughed at their strange customs and their emotional outbursts and their stubborn refusal to accept that some problems simply could not be solved. She thought about the human ambassador, who had once told her that the reason humans helped other species was because they knew what it felt like to be alone in the universe, and they did not want anyone else to feel that way. At the time, she had thought it was sentimental nonsense. But now she understood what he had meant. The galaxy was alone now, truly alone. And it was only in their absence that anyone could see how much light the humans had brought with them. Sylph made a decision in that moment, a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would find out what happened to humanity. No matter how long it took, and no matter what it cost, she owed them that much. She owed them so much more than that. But it was a place to start. 6 months had passed since the disappearance, and the galaxy was beginning to fall apart. The Rithian Trade Consortium declared bankruptcy on a cold morning that saw riots break out across 17 of their worlds. Because millions of workers had lost their jobs and had no way to feed their families, the consortium had built their entire economy around human demand, around those strange apes who seemed to want everything and who paid fair prices and who somehow made worthless cultural artifacts into treasures that other species would fight to own without humans to buy their goods and sell them new ideas. The Rethines found that they had forgotten how to trade with anyone else. Their merchants had become so used to the easy honesty of human business dealings that they no longer knew how to navigate the complex webs of deception and favor trading. That other species preferred the Deleth Principality was the next to fall. Though their collapse came from war rather than economics, the Kovathi swarm had been waiting for this moment for over a century, ever since a human diplomat named Sarah Chun had somehow convinced them to sign a peace treaty that they had always intended to break now. Sarah Chun was gone along with every other human in the galaxy, and there was nobody left who could look a Kovathi hive mind in the eye and make it feel ashamed of its own hunger. The swarm descended on the principality like a plague of locusts, consuming world after world while the council debated what to do, and the other great powers calculated whether intervention would be profitable. High Arbiter Sylveth watched the destruction from her chambers and remembered a conversation she had once had with the human ambassador about the nature of peace. "You think peace is the absence of war," he had told her, with that strange, sad smile that humans sometimes wore. But peace is not something that exists on its own. It is something that must be built every single day by people who refuse to give up on each other. She had dismissed his words as naive at the time, because the elder races knew that peace was simply a matter of having enough weapons to make war too costly. But the humans had understood something that the elder races had forgotten. Something about the importance of connection and trust and genuine care for the well-being of others. The council held an emergency session to address the growing chaos, and Sylveth presented her findings about human contributions to galactic civilization. The delegates listened in stunned silence as she explained that humans had been responsible for mediating over 3,000 disputes, that they had answered almost all distress calls, that they had contributed to nearly half of all medical and technological advances. "We laughed at them," Sylveth said, her voice breaking as she spoke. "We called them children, and we mocked their emotions, and we treated them as if they were barely worthy of a seat at our table. And all that time they were saving us from ourselves." Some delegates refused to believe her, insisting that the records must be wrong or that humans had somehow manipulated the data to make themselves look important. But others remembered their own encounters with humanity, the small kindnesses and the unexpected help and the stubborn refusal to let anyone suffer alone. A Valkyrie elder rose to speak, and the chamber fell silent out of respect for his age and wisdom. "I remember when the humans first came to us," he said. "They were so young and so fragile and so full of fear. And we told them that they would never survive in a galaxy that did not care about their feelings." He paused and looked around at the assembled delegates with eyes that had seen more than any of them could imagine. "But they did not listen to us, because humans never listen when you tell them that something is impossible. They just smile and say they will try it anyway." The elder sat down and the chamber erupted into chaos, with delegates shouting accusations at each other and blaming everyone but themselves for the situation. Sylveth tried to restore order, but found that nobody was willing to listen, because listening would mean admitting that they had been wrong about humans and wrong about themselves. The session ended without any decisions being made, and Sylveth returned to her chambers feeling more hopeless than she had ever felt in her long life. She began to compile a record of everything that was going wrong in the galaxy, a document that she intended to present to future generations as a warning about the cost of arrogance. The list grew longer every day as new reports came in from every corner of known space. The medical research stations that humans had funded began to close, leaving diseases untreated and discoveries unmade. The cultural exchanges that humans had organized fell apart, leaving species isolated and suspicious of each other. The emergency response networks that humans had built stopped functioning, leaving ships stranded in colonies to fend for themselves. And everywhere Sylveth looked, she saw the same pattern repeating itself. The same story of something that had seemed unimportant turning out to be essentially human merchant had taught the Kethmari how to laugh at themselves. And without that lesson, they returned to their old habits of taking offense at everything and starting conflicts over imagined insults. A human engineer had shown the Valkyrie how to maintain their ancient ships. And without that knowledge, their fleet began to break down one vessel at a time. A human teacher had inspired a generation of Rithian students to dream of something bigger than profit. And without that inspiration, they returned to the empty pursuit of wealth that had nearly destroyed their civilization. Once before, Sylveth realized that the humans had not just helped the galaxy with their technology and their trade and their diplomacy. They had had help by simply being themselves. They had brought something new to a galaxy that had grown old and tired and cynical, something that the elder races had lost long ago and forgotten they ever had. The humans called it hope, and they gave it away freely to anyone who needed it. Now that hope was gone, and the galaxy was discovering what it meant to live without itself, received a message one evening from an old friend, a Kovathi drone who had defected from the swarm years ago. After a human had saved his life, "I keep waiting for them to come back," he wrote. "I keep thinking that this is some kind of test and that any day now the humans will appear and tell us that everything is going to be okay. But they do not come, and I'm starting to believe that they never will." Sylveth read the message and felt tears forming in her eyes, something that had not happened to her in centuries. She understood what her friend meant because she had been waiting too, hoping that this was all some terrible mistake that would be corrected if she just waited long enough. But the humans did not come back, and the galaxy continued to fall apart around her as she thought about the empty chair in the council chamber and all the voices that would never fill it again. And she made herself a promise. She would not let the galaxy forget what it had lost. Even if remembering brought nothing but pain, you would keep the record of human kindness alive, so that future generations would know that once upon a time, there had been a species that cared about others more than they cared about themselves. It was not much, but it was all she could don. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she still held on to the smallest fragment of hope that someday, somehow, the humans would return. She knew it was foolish, but she could not help it. The humans had taught her to hope, and it was the one lesson she could not bring herself to forget. 20 years had passed since the day humanity vanished from the galaxy, and the universe had become a darker and colder place. The Galactic Council still met in its great hall, but the assembly had shrunk to less than half its former size as species withdrew or were conquered or simply stopped caring about interstellar affairs. High Arbiter Sylveth had died 5 years ago, leaving behind a vast archive of records about human contributions to galactic civilization that most species refused to read. Her successor, a young Kethmari named Vethan, had taken up her mission and continued to gather stories about humanity from anyone willing to share them. Vethan had never met a human herself, having been born just a few years before the disappearance. But she felt as though she knew them through the countless tales she had collected. She knew about the human doctor who had worked for 30 years on a Rithian Mayan colony, treating patients for free because he believed that health care was a right rather than a privilege. She knew about the human engineer who had spent her entire savings to repair a Valkyrie temple ship, asking for nothing in return except the chance to see it fly again. She knew about the human soldiers who had died defending a Kefmari colony from pirates, even though the colony had refused to pay for protection and had treated the humans with contempt. These stories had become precious to Vethan, because they reminded her that the galaxy had not always been so cruel and hopeless. The Korathi swarm had consumed the entire Deleth Principality and was now turning its hungry eyes toward other territories. And nobody had the strength or the will to stop them. The great trade routes had collapsed into a handful of dangerous corridors controlled by pirates and warlords, making interstellar commerce almost impossible for honest merchants. The research stations had fallen silent, their scientists scattered or dead, and the technology that humanity had helped to improve was slowly breaking down without anyone to maintain it. Vethan had created a memorial world on a small planet called Sanctuary 7, a place where species who remembered humanity could come to share their stories and mourn their loss. The planet had once been a barren rock, but Vethan had used the last of her family's wealth to terraform it into a garden filled with plants from human colonies. She did not know why this felt important to her, but she could not shake the feeling that humanity would want to be remembered in a place of beauty and life. Visitors came to Sanctuary 7 from across the galaxy, often risking their lives to make the journey through increasingly dangerous space. They came because they needed to remember, because the galaxy was trying very hard to forget that humans had ever existed, and they refused to let that happen. An old Velkari telepath arrived one day, his mind scarred by decades of searching the void for any trace of human consciousness. "I never found them," he told Vethan, "but I found something else. Something I did not expect." He explained that while searching for humans, he had encountered the echoes of their influence in the minds of almost every species he touched. Humans had left marks on the galaxy that went deeper than technology or trade or politics. Marks that existed in the thoughts and feelings and dreams of beings who had never met a human in their lives. "They changed us," the old telepath said. "They made us better than we were, and even though they are gone, that change remains." Vethan added his words to her collection and wondered if that was enough. If the memory of human kindness could somehow save a galaxy that seemed determined to destroy itself. A young Korvathi drone arrived at Sanctuary 7 one evening, trembling with fear and exhaustion after escaping from the swarm. The drone had been secretly spared by its hive mother, who had been touched by human kindness years ago, and could not bring herself to sacrifice all of her children to the endless hunger of the collective. Then welcomed the drone and gave it food and shelter, treating it with the same compassion that humans had once shown to refugees from the swarm. The drone stayed on Sanctuary 7 and began to ask questions about humanity, questions that Vethan was happy to answer. Were the humans gods? The drone asked one night. "They sound like the gods from our oldest stories, beings of light who came to help the worthy and punish the wicked." Vethan thought about this question for a long time before answering. "No," she said finally. "The humans were not gods. They were mortal and fragile, and they lived such short lives compared to the elder races." She looked up at the stars and thought about all the human worlds that now sat empty and silent. That was what made them remarkable. She continued, "They knew they were going to die. They knew that their time in the universe was limited, and they still chose to spend that time helping others." The drone did not understand this at first, because the Korvathi only valued strength and survival and the endless expansion of the swarm. But as the months passed and the drone learned more about humanity, something began to change inside its mind. It started to see value in things other than consumption, to find meaning in connection rather than conquest, to feel something that might have been called compassion. Vethan watched this transformation with wonder and realized that the humans were still teaching, even from beyond the grave. Their example was powerful enough to change a being that had been bred for nothing but destruction. And if it could change one Korvathi drone, then perhaps it could change others. She began to think about ways to spread the stories of humanity further, to reach species that had never heard of them or had only known them as enemies. It would be difficult and dangerous, but it felt like something a human would do. The years continued to pass, and Sanctuary 7 became a beacon of hope in a galaxy that had nearly forgotten what hope meant. Species that had been enemies for millennia came to the memorial world and found that they could talk to each other without fighting. As long as they were talking about humans, Vithan grew old in the service of memory, gathering more stories and welcoming more visitors, and watching as the small flame she had lit spread slowly across the darkness. She knew that she could not save the galaxy by herself, and she knew that the humans might never return to see what she had built in their honor, but she kept working anyway, because that was what the humans would have done. She remembered a human saying that Sylveth had recorded in her archives, a saying that had become the motto of Sanctuary 7. It is better to light a single candle than to curse the darkness. The humans had been the galaxy's candle, and now it was up to those who remembered them to keep that light alive. Ethan looked up at the stars every night and whispered a prayer to whatever force had taken humanity away, asking it to send them back. She did not really believe that anyone was listening, but she could not bring herself to stop hoping. Hope was the greatest gift that humans had given to the galaxy, and Vethan would carry it with her until her last breath. And sometimes, late at night when the stars were brightest, she could almost swear that she heard something in the void, a distant voice calling out across impossible distances, but she could never quite make out the words. And by morning, she always convinced herself that it had been nothing more than a dream. 43 years after the disappearance, a signal pierced the void and changed everything. It came from beyond the galactic rim, from a region of space so distant and so empty that no council vessel had ever ventured there in all the millions of years of recorded history. The signal was detected first by a small listening post on the edge of known space, a station that had been built by humans long ago and was now operated by a handful of Valkyrie scientists who had dedicated their lives to searching for any trace of the lost species. The scientists did not believe what their instruments were telling them at first, because they had spent decades listening to nothing but silence and static, but the signal was real, and it was growing stronger by the hour, and it carried a message that would make beings across 1,000 worlds weep with joy and fear and disbelief. The message was simple: BROADCAST, in every known language and encoded with signatures that could only have come from human technology. We heard you calling. We are coming home. The scientists sent word to Sanctuary 7, and Vethan received the news in her garden where she had been tending to the flowers that humans had once loved. She was old now, her forearms trembling with age and her eyes dimmed by decades of grief. But when she heard the message, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt young again, filled with an energy that she had thought was lost forever. She immediately called an emergency session of what remained of the Galactic Council, demanding that every surviving delegate attend in person. The council chamber had not been so full since the early days after the disappearance, when species had still believed that the problem could be solved through debate and legislation. Now delegates crowded into seats that had been empty for decades, their eyes fixed on the main display where the human signal was being broadcast for all to see. We heard you calling. We are coming home. The words repeated over and over, a promise that seemed too good to be true after so many years of silence. Some delegates refused to believe it, arguing that the signal must be a hoax or a trap set by some unknown enemy. Others wept openly, not caring who saw their tears, because they had spent their entire lives waiting for this moment and had almost given up hope. Vethan stood before the assembly and raised her trembling arms for silence. I do not know where the humans went, she said. and I do not know why they left or what they have been doing all these years. But I know one thing with absolute certainty." She paused and looked around at the faces of species who had once ruled the galaxy with arrogance and pride. "I know that we are not ready for them to come back." The chamber erupted into confused murmurs, and Vethan waited for quiet before continuing. "Look at what we have become in their absence," she said. "The Kolvathi have consumed entire civilizations while we did nothing. The trade routes have collapsed. The research stations have gone dark. And species that once lived in peace now kill each other over scraps of territory." She gestured at the empty seats that still bore the names of species that no longer existed. The humans left behind a galaxy that was flawed but hopeful. A galaxy that was slowly learning to be better. And we let it fall into ruin. A Rithian delegate rose to object. His scales flushed with anger. "We did our best," he protested. "It was not our fault that the humans abandoned us without warning." Vethan fixed him with a look that silenced him immediately. "We did not do our best," she replied. "We did what was easy. We did what was profitable. We did what served our own interests, and we told ourselves that it was the humans who had been holding us back." She turned to address the entire assembly. "I have spent my life collecting stories about humanity. And do you know what I have learned from those stories? I have learned that humans were not special because they were smarter or stronger or more advanced than us." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Humans were special because they chose to be kind when they could have been cruel. They chose to help when they could have walked away. They chose to hope when everyone around them had given up." She pointed at the signal still scrolling across the display. "The humans are coming back, and they will see what we have allowed to happen in their absence. They will see the wars and the famines and the injustice. And we will have to explain ourselves." A Valkyrie elder spoke up, his voice heavy with shame. "What would you have us do? It has been 43 years. We cannot undo the damage in whatever time we have left." Vethan shook her head. "We cannot undo the damage, but we can begin to repair it. We can show the humans that their example was not forgotten, that there are still beings in this galaxy who remember what kindness looks like." She announced the formation of a new initiative, named after the human woman who had once brokered peace between the Kolvathi and the Deleth. Sarachun Reconciliation Project would work to end conflicts, rebuild trade networks, restart research stations, and restore the connections that had withered since humanity's departure. "We have 43 years of failure to answer for," Vethan said. "I suggest we begin now." The delegates dispersed with a new sense of purpose. And for the first time in decades, the council actually accomplished something meaningful. The Saracen project grew quickly, attracting volunteers from species that had spent years fighting each other. Something about the imminent return of humanity made old grudges seem less important. As if everyone wanted to be seen at their best, when the humans finally arrived, the Korvathi swarm was harder to reach. But even they began to slow their expansion when they received word of the signal. The current Hive Queen had been touched by human kindness in her youth, and she remembered what it had felt like to be seen as something other than a monster. She did not make peace, but she did not make war either, and for the galaxy, that was enough. Vethan worked tirelessly despite her advanced age, coordinating efforts across thousands of worlds and refusing to rest until she collapsed from exhaustion. Her doctors told her that she was killing herself with overwork, but she just smiled and said that she wanted to live long enough to shake a human's hand. The signal grew stronger every day, and astronomers began to track its source as it moved closer to the galactic rim. Whoever was sending it was traveling fast, faster than any known technology should allow, crossing distances that should have taken centuries in a matter of months. And as they watched and waited and worked, the galaxy began to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly and steadily in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year before. Species that had been enemies for generations began to talk, and talking led to understanding. And understanding led to something that might have been called friendship. Research stations reopened, and scientists shared their findings freely. The way humans had always wanted them to trade routes were cleared of pirates, and merchants began to travel safely again, selling goods at fair prices to anyone who needed them. It was not perfect. It was not even close to what the galaxy had been before the disappearance. But it was a start, and every night, across 1,000 worlds, beings looked up at the stars and whispered the same words. "They are coming home." It was a prayer and a promise and a warning all at once. And nobody knew whether they should feel joy or fear at what was approaching. But for the first time in 43 years, the galaxy felt something that it had almost forgotten how to feel. It felt hope. The fleet emerged from the void like a sunrise after an endless night. And every being in the galaxy who had access to a view screen stopped what they were doing to watch. These were not the ships that anyone remembered. Not the crude practical vessels held together by ingenuity and stubbornness that humans had flown before the disappearance. These ships were magnificent, sleek and shining with technology that made the finest achievements of the elder races look like children's toys. They moved through space with a grace that seemed almost impossible, as if they were dancing with the stars themselves. The fleet numbered in the thousands, far more ships than humanity had possessed before they vanished. And each one was larger and more advanced than anything the galaxy had ever seen. But the most remarkable thing about the ships was not their size or their technology or their beauty. The most remarkable thing was the symbol they carried on their hulls. A simple image of a hand reaching out toward the stars. It was the symbol of the Humanity First Response Network, the volunteer organization that had answered distress calls throughout the galaxy for nearly 2 centuries. The humans had not forgotten who they were. Even after 43 years away and whatever experiences had transformed their technology beyond recognition, Rin stood in the council chamber surrounded by delegates from every surviving species, her old heart pounding in her chest as the fleet approached. She had lived just long enough to see this moment. Though her doctors said it was a miracle that she was still breathing at all, the main display showed a single ship separating from the fleet and descending toward the council station. A small vessel compared to the giants around it, but still larger than any human ship from before the airlock doors opened and a figure stepped through. And the assembly fell absolutely silent. She was small, so much smaller than Vethan had imagined, with soft skin and forward-facing eyes, and none of the natural weapons that most species considered essential for survival. But there was something in her gaze that made every being in the room feel like she could see straight through them. A weight of experience and wisdom that seemed impossible for such a short-lived creature. Ambassador Chen Wei-Lin walked to the center of the chamber and looked around at the thousands of faces staring back at her. She was wearing a simple uniform with no decorations except for a small pin on her collar. And Vethan recognized the pin as the symbol of the Humanity First Response Network. "We apologize for our absence," the ambassador said, a voice calm and clear and somehow filling the entire chamber without any apparent effort. "We were called away. There was a threat beyond the rim, something old and hungry that had been sleeping for millions of years and was beginning to wake." She paused and let her words sink in. "We knew about this threat because we had been exploring beyond the boundaries of known space, looking for new worlds and new resources to share with the galaxy. And when we found it, we realized that it would consume everything if it was not stopped." The assembly hung on her every word, because this was the answer to the question that had haunted them for 43 years. "We could have asked for help," the ambassador continued. "We could have warned the council and formed a coalition and fought this thing together. But we chose not to. because we knew the galaxy was not ready. She looked directly at Vithan as she spoke. We knew that if we told you about the threat, many species would panic and others would refuse to believe us, and the coalition would fall apart before it ever formed. So we made a choice. Her voice softened. We chose to face it alone, to bear the burden ourselves rather than drag you into a war that you were not prepared for, and it cost us. It cost us more than you can possibly imagine. She fell silent for a moment, and Vithan could see the weight of grief on her shoulders. We lost billions of our people over the years. Brave men and women who gave their lives to hold the line while we developed the technology we needed to win. And we will carry their memory with us forever. A Karvathi delegate rose to speak, his voice trembling. Why? Why did you sacrifice so much for a galaxy that had shown you nothing but contempt? Ambassador Chun smiled. And it was the same strange, sad smile that humans had always worn when they tried to explain themselves to species that did not understand. Because that is what humans do. She said simply, we protect the people we love, even when they do not love us back, even when they do not deserve it, even when it hurts. She turned to address the assembly directly. We heard you. All those years we were fighting in the darkness beyond the rim. We heard you missing us and mourning us and telling stories about us. And it broke our hearts to know that you were suffering. Her eyes found Bethan again. We heard about Sanctuary 7 and the work you did to keep our memory alive. And we wept with gratitude because we thought we might have been forgotten. But you remembered, and you taught others to remember. And that gave us the strength to keep fighting. Bethan felt tears streaming down her face. More tears than she had thought her old body could produce. We did not forget, she managed to say. We could not forget. Not after everything you had done for us. Ambassador Chun crossed the chamber and knelt before Vitan's chair, taking the old Kethmari's hands in her own. You did more than remember, she said gently. You learned. You changed. You started to become the galaxy that we always believed you could be. She gestured at the assembled delegates. And species that had been enemies for millennia, now sitting side by side in peace. We have been watching you for the past months as we approached. And we have seen what you accomplished with the Sarah Chen project. We have seen old enemies becoming friends and research stations, reopening and trade routes being rebuilt. She stood and faced the assembly with pride shining in her eyes. You did not need us to save you. You saved yourselves. You just needed to remember that it was possible. A Velkari elder spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. We failed you. In your absence, we allowed terrible things to happen. Wars and famines and suffering that you would never have permitted. Ambassador Chun nodded slowly. We know. We saw everything that happened, and it hurt us to watch from so far away and know that we could not help. She paused and then smiled again. Brighter this time, but we also saw people trying to do better. We saw Vethan building Sanctuary 7. We saw the Karvathi drone learning compassion. We saw species that had every reason to hate each other choosing reconciliation instead. She spread her arms wide, as if embracing the entire galaxy. You fell down. Yes, but you got back up, and that is all we could ever ask of anyone. Because that is what humans do. We fall down, and we get back up, and we try again. Vethan struggled to her feet despite her doctor's protests and stood face to face with the human ambassador. What happens now? She asked. Ambassador Chun took her hand again. Now we rebuild. Together, humans and Kethmari and Velkari and Rithines. And yes, even the Korvathi, if they are willing to learn. She looked around at the assembly. We brought back new technology and new knowledge and new friends who want to meet you. Beings from beyond the rim who helped us win our war and who are curious about the galaxy we have told them so much about. She squeezed Vethan's hand, but most importantly, we brought back ourselves, the same stubborn, caring, annoying humans that you remember. And we are not going anywhere ever again. The chamber erupted into cheers. and tears and sounds of joy that echoed through the station and out into the void with, and held onto Ambassador Chun's hand and felt her old heart filling with a light she had almost forgotten existed. "Welcome home," she whispered. Ambassador Chun smiled that human smile, full of warmth and sadness and hope all at once. "It is good to be home," she replied. "Now let us get to work. We have a galaxy to rebuild," and they did in the centuries that followed. Scholars would write countless books about what made humanity unique, trying to understand why such a small, fragile, short-lived species had changed the galaxy forever. They would analyze human technology and human art and human philosophy, searching for the secret that made humans different from everyone else. But the beings who had lived through the disappearance and return knew that the scholars were looking in the wrong place. The secret of humanity was not in their science or their culture or their ideas. The secret was much simpler than that. Humans never gave up on anyone, not on their enemies, not on their friends, not on strangers they had never met, not even on those who had given up on themselves. They believed that everyone deserved a second chance, a third chance, as many chances as it took, and in a galaxy that had grown old and tired and cynical. That belief was more powerful than any weapon ever invented. Vithan lived for another 10 years after the return, long enough to see the first joint human-alien research station open and the first Korvathi ambassador take his seat at the council, and the first children born, who would never know a galaxy without humans on her. Last night, she sat in her garden on Sanctuary 7, surrounded by friends from a dozen different species, and she looked up at the stars with a smile on her face. "They came back," she said softly. "I always knew they would come back." And as she closed her eyes for the final time, she felt a human hand squeeze hers gently. And she knew that she was not alone. Nobody was alone anymore. The humans had made sure of that.